live? Oh, almost live. Should I give it a minute? Okay, maybe not. Hi, I'm A.T. Greenblatt. Welcome to a Sunday morning panel at Readercon. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're awake or semi-awake with your coffees or whatever. We're going to talk to you about emotions and dystopia. So as I said, I'm A.T. Greenblatt. I'm your moderator today. I am a short story writer with stories in Clarksville, Beneath the Skies, Uncanny Magazine. Have a story coming out on tour next month, which I'm very excited. And yeah, I'm a mechanical engineer and I write stories in my free time. So I have a group of wonderful panelists today. I'll let them introduce yourself. Why don't you start us off, Sabrina?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sabrina Vervulius. I'm a short story writer, novelist, journalist. One of my novels, which was published originally in 2012 by Cross Genres and reissued in 2018 by Rosarian Publishing, is my novel Ink, and it is an immigration dystopia. So that's why I'm interested in being part.
All right, how about you, Bracken?
Hi, I'm Bracken McLeod. I'm also a novelist. It's funny, I don't actually write dystopian fiction, but I love to read it. So I suppose that my interaction here will be more as a consumer of it. I guess I also have perspectives as having, from having lived through the last 5 years of American politics, but I've written several novels. Stranded, the newest one is Closing Costs, out now from HarperCollins. It's under the Mariner imprint.
Great. How about you, Holly?
Hi, I'm Holly Lynn Walrath, and I write short fiction and poetry. I have some short stories out in Strange Horizons and flash fiction online, and I write a lot of poetry that's been in Analog and some other places. And I have a new book coming out later this year of poems that's called The Smallest of Bones, which is my bone friend here. And I did a lot of research on dystopia in YA fiction in my creative writing master's program. So that's always been one of my very favorite sort of subgenres of speculative fiction, and that's why I wanted to be on the panel.
Very cool. How about you, Scott?
I am Scott Edelman, and my focus is short fiction. I published 102 short stories. The 103rd is about to come out. The 102nd is in Prisms, an anthology from PS Publishing. The 103rd is in Weird Book, and I realized coincidentally both of them are dystopias, and which caused me to go back and look at my list of my 103 sold and published short stories and do a breakdown of how many were dystopias and how many were not dystopias. And I made some surprising discoveries, which we can talk about later. I'm also a podcaster. I host the Eating the Fantastic podcast on which Eliza has been on, in which we eat food and break bread and loosen our tongues by doing that and discussing things. The 151st episode just went live on Friday. Oh, and I've got a T-shirt showing the logo of it there. Not that
Oh, nice.
If we were in the room together, you would have been able to see it.
Well, very cool. Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in dystopian stories. And that kind of leads me into my first question, like, why do we tell these stories? Why are we interested in them? What draws us into it, into such bleak visions of the future or the present in a lot of cases? Anyone want to start?
Don't everyone jump in at once. Yeah, yeah, I'll start. Because I had mentioned, that my primary interest in this is as a consumer of dystopian fiction, and I sort of grew up on this. My favorite science fiction to read as a kid was this dystopian fiction from the 1940s, where people were, Ray Bradbury and George Orwell were dealing with the state of the world at that time. So, I grew up on Fahrenheit 451 and Zamyatin's We and 1984 and just, love the idea of stories about people in sort of global adversity finding the ability to overcome circumstances, and it seemed to me that the appeal of dystopian fiction to me was less about overcoming a personal problem that was inhibiting just them, as opposed to rallying together and overcoming a societal problem which is inhibiting everyone. And I felt like it was such a neat, at the time, wholly alien concept to me that that you could be living in a world that is so dysfunctional.
I'd like to say that a lot of dystopias are cautionary, and some of them are really cautionary and prophetic in a way, revealing situations that are hidden from view, or are not discussed. Certainly that's true of my novel. I was heavily involved in immigrant advocacy, and knew what was going on that was really not at that point common knowledge. And so it was nothing to then just push the immigration situation that was happening at that time into dystopia. As it turns out, who knew that my imagination wasn't horrible enough to accommodate what the situation grew to in the US, although there are a number of things that at least so far haven't been revealed to have happened. But I think that in that instance, it was very much a situation where I was writing out of a sense of caution and a sense of more knowledge than most folks had. On the other hand, I have a very dystopic short story up at Apex a while back, called Toward a New Lexicon of Augury, which really clearly the dystopia is climate change related. And that's obviously something where at this point we shouldn't be writing cautionary dystopias about climate change because it's here.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that a lot of dystopia takes what seems like a little known issue or a small issue and sort of extrapolates it into what if several years down the road this continues, and what if this grows and becomes this bigger issue on a larger societal way. And I think a lot of dystopia is about shining a light on things that people might necessarily not necessarily know about. Like, I think about The Handmaid's Tale and Margaret Atwood saying that like everything in that book is based on some aspect of reality that has happened in the past, and people just aren't sort of aware of those things. And so it really has an opportunity to highlight that. So
I think dystopias are often the lies we tell ourselves, and the lie that we tell ourselves in dystopias are we will be the ones who will survive the dystopias. That we read them and we think, no, we're not going to be the one who gets crushed by it. Somehow, we will outlive it. And I think of it as akin to the things I read as a kid, which weren't dystopias, but they were stories in which the world fell away. Things like Robinson Crusoe, things like Swiss Family Robinson, where you'd say, oh yes, if I were abandoned on a deserted island, surely I would figure out how to build a steam engine out of coconuts and bamboo. I would be rather than starving to death. And so it ends up being a comfort. And with dystopias, I think the same thing happens. We're living in dystopias, or dystopias coming upon us. Also, dystopias can be regional. My goodness, look at what's going on in Haiti at the moment and other places in the world. I mean, they talk about the future is occurring in different places around the world. Well, the same thing happens with dystopias due to the privilege of certain places. But I do tend to think that's what preppers are doing too, when they're saying, oh, I got mine, Jack, and I will figure out how to stay alive, and everybody else can fall apart, as opposed to the comfort of the Cory Doctorow dystopias, which believes we will all band together and help one another. But I do think often that's why we read them, to pretend that we will figure it out and we'll be the ones who survive whatever comes next.
I'd like to say that as a Latina, I write dystopia with Latinos in it, because I never see myself as portrayed as one of the people who survives, and in other dystopias. So it's really important to me to write from the standpoint of the people you don't see surviving, and sort of the radical solidarity and the radical activism it takes for people like immigrants or Latinos, or people of color in general, to survive dystopic conditions.
Yeah,
I think,
I agree.
yeah, I think that's there's a really great point here about privilege and perspective, which is that there are people living in emerging dystopic conditions right now. But me, as a white guy in America, and sitting in this lovely house, I'm untouched by it, except intellectually. But if you look at what's happening in Haiti after a political assassination and an earthquake, and the unfolding situation in Afghanistan right now, I mean, the perception of what's a dystopia and what's not a dystopia is very relative to your affluence, your accident of birth, your economic and social situation. And and if there's anything one hopes dystopic fiction can do, it's create empathy across these borders of separation between hardship and comfort.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, because like you were saying that, Scott, and I was like, I would never make it. Because I have a lot of chronic illness and medications that I have to have, and I think people with chronic illness and disability, really that's been a huge discussion. And as far as dystopia as a genre goes, is what do we do with this genre that's you would definitely not make it, and I think about the origin of dystopia being utopia, right? So the first book that sort of dealt with this was Thomas More's Utopia, which was in 1516. And it was a utopia, right? It was this imagining of a perfect society, and very often that results in a dystopia for the marginalized groups. So
I also, as someone who also has a disability, and this is a conversation I think that's been coming up, especially in the last couple of years, that the flip side of all this discussion is that the marginalized groups actually have more practice in dealing with dystopias. So in some ways, we are the types of groups who will survive, because we already kind of know what it's like to live in a broken system. Which is not to say it's going to be uniform or fair across the board by any stretch of the imagination. But
yeah, one statistic that relates to that, I saw someone mention on Twitter the other day that the vaccination rate within the LGBTQIA community is somewhere over 90%, because it's, hey, we already lived through a plague. We already dealt with AIDS. We know we're supposed to protect ourselves. And So having been through it, that sort of connects with what you mentioned about people already, living through that.
And you certainly see the disconnect between conceptual preparation that is not born out of any sort of adversity, but like all the preppers who've stockpiled canned food and guns and have a bunker, but were completely unwilling to wear a mask in public. Right. And it's like, well, you think you're going to survive, but all you're prepping for is a siege. Right. But the long haul in terms of an environmental or epidemiological disaster aren't going to sort themselves out with a long rifle and 10,000 rounds.
Right. And I think what a lot of dystopias miss is how people survive through community. Which I kind of wanted to bring back into the panel topic, which is, what do you think dystopian stories usually miss? I mean, there's obviously, in terms of emotions, despair and devastation and all that stuff, but it's kind of a very small picture of a much bigger problem. So what do you think stories miss? And
I think your point that you just made now is super salient, which is that a lot of what they miss is how community is essential to survival as opposed to individualism. And in American society especially, we're so enraptured with the ultra competent individual who solves all of our problems that we forget about community and how important it is not just to have people who can hunt and make fires, but people who can weave and sew and create fab, because your stuff is going to wear out and winter's coming, and if nobody knows how to make a blanket, we're going to freeze to death around all this great meat to eat, and or whatever. I think the other thing that gets missed, and it's kind of the title of the panel, are those small moments of joy that help you persevere. I'm thinking about COVID and the fact that I didn't get to see any of my friends for 15, 18 months, and that first hug between people who've been separated for that long is such a perfect moment of joy that it kind of feeds your soul in a way that helps you keep going.
I think that in general dystopias miss out on the day-to-day. They miss out on the fact that, yeah, you're in a dystopia and you still fall in love. You're in a dystopia and you still have to cook dinner. And they focus very much on sort of the really horrific aspects of dystopia. And what we know from living in communities that are going through turmoil is that you can be an activist, you can be horrified and concerned, but you're still going to tie your kids' shoes and teach them how to tie it themselves. And those are the small joys that Bracken was talking about. And I think that they're more frequent than you would imagine in a dystopic situation.
well, I think also that after living through the pandemic, like, it's amazing how normal a dystopia feels after a while, and like how much Black humor comes out from it, and just things like that. So I feel like stories are really missing out on both the normalization of dystopias and just also how people cope and silliness.
Yeah, going back to the joy and the small thing, the joy that Bracken was mentioning, the small things Sabrina is mentioning, makes me think of the famous Emma Goldman line about, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution. Well, if I can't dance, I don't want your dystopia either. That basically there's going to be dancing, there's going to be those joyful things occurring in the midst of it, and we don't see much of that in fiction. And also there will always be the people who say, you shouldn't be doing that. How dare you have a moment of happiness when all these horrible things are happening? But it's something that is necessary. But the other thing I think of that we don't see in dystopia as it has been written so far, that we have only learned about in the past 17 months is how many people said, "Oh, come zombie, bite me." You know, we always thought that, you know, everyone would run away from the zombies. And we're living in a situation where people are saying, you know, who cares? Let me walk among them and let me do nothing to protect myself,
Yeah, no,
you know, from them. So it
I'm
basically
bitten, but it's a
invalidates
hoax.
all the zombie stories that I've, you know, written and seen read, because we never populated them with those types of people.
Well, except in political dystopias, right?
Mhm.
I mean, political dystopias are full of people who refuse to pay attention.
True.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you know, the political dystopias absolutely are filled with people who not only refuse to pay attention, but who collaborate, right? I mean, you think about like 1984, right? And Winston Smith is surrounded by people who are not just willing, but committed to perpetuating the system in which they live, right? You know, Big Brother is watching, and so it's you know, when you found, I think you found that in our sort of minor political dystopia of the last, or major political dystopia of the last 4 years, is that there's a surprising amount of people who are willing to enable, collaborate with, and run right alongside horrible ideas and behaviors because they feel like they will benefit from them.
And another lie they tell themselves is, oh, the dystopia would be so much worse if I didn't collaborate, so I have to collaborate. Now that's how they go to sleep at night, by telling themselves that.
Right.
We have a question from one of the audience members who would like us to talk a little bit about like what's the difference between a dystopia created by catastrophe or one that's self-made, human-made. I'm changing the question a little bit, but do people have thoughts on that?
Well, the impacts of catastrophe usually become dystopic because of human-made decisions or human-made structures of inequity, right? I mean, you know, if your infrastructure has been neglected or is non-existent, a disaster, a natural disaster, can immediately throw you into a situation of dystopia. So they're not unrelated.
Yeah, there is an aspect of the natural one, you know, hurricanes, earthquakes, that you say, well, we didn't see that coming. But as Sabrina pointed out with the infrastructure, if you build hurricane-proof buildings, if you have built earthquake-proof buildings, then when the earthquake happens, it will not have a severe dystopic impact as it would have had. So you can't say we didn't see those things coming, because we could have prepared for even the you know, the natural versus the man-made one, because well, the natural ones eventually are in a way man-made ones, person-made ones as well.
I mean, you see, I think the thing about you know, catastrophic, you know, natural disasters is that they point out exactly how you know, their suddenness points out how unprepared you are for them, and the level of catastrophe that results is relatable to your ability to respond. You know, I think about like Hurricane Katrina, right? And how New Orleans was affected by that because of our shitty response to you know, to that catastrophe, and it created a dystopic effect that was probably preventable, or at least something we could have ameliorated if we had done more ahead of time to be there.
Or even like the fragility of our safety net. And so often that's a political choice to not invest in safety net programs, you know. So all of those contribute to just how grand the scale of damage and a natural catastrophe can wreak.
Yeah, and post-catastrophic recovery, right?
I also think with natural disasters that happen suddenly, there's usually an outpour from everyone very quickly trying to help, and then it tapers off very quickly. and the sustained effort to actually make a difference.
Right, unless it's Puerto Rico.
Right.
Mhm.
All right. Well, yeah. But I think with the self-made ones, we're more likely to try to ignore it longer. We as a society, that is.
I just wanted to add in to reinforce AT what you said. I told you I'm a journalist. I'm the editor of a news site that focuses on nonprofits and social impact organizations. And with the pandemic, we really saw huge increase in giving to food programs. But then, the attention goes away, or it starts seeming like we're on path of recovery. And those same organizations that got a lot of support initially started seeing that, the contributions really dwindled at a pace that, they were still fulfilling the increased need. And so, there's an initial outpouring, but there's not a sustained outpouring.
Right. Before I get into more audience questions, I actually wanted to get into this one, which I think we've been kind of dancing around all panel, but there's a huge kind of class and privilege element to dystopias. And it kind of reflects who's writing the story, what it's trying to address. But I mean, we're trying to make science fiction more inclusive, better. So how do we go about creating more nuanced, more complicated stories that recognize that a lot of people living in our world now are living in a dystopia?
I think a great example of a dystopia series that does that is this The Road to Nowhere by Meg Ellison, which kind of focuses on like women's role in a dystopia and like reproductive health post societal collapse, and those kind of things of like how would you like treat like a UTI post dystopia. And so I love books that are kind of like I think we're seeing a lot more of those books now that are drawing on these like specific focuses, and looking at those like sort of social issues in a way of like how would we solve that, and going back to the collective. At Interstellar Flight Press, where I'm an editor, we're working on a book that's a dystopia, but I have a hard time describing it as such because it's sort of like a cozy dystopia. Like, I don't know how else to describe it, but like the characters are very like it's a diverse cast, and it's a collective of people working together to build a community post dystopia, and there are like conflicts that arise, but it's not like action scene action scene action scene. It's like characters working together, and so that's been really fun to work with that author on, and I'm excited about kind of where these books are taking us.
There's a great book by Ardeth, I think it's Ardeth Mayer, called The End of the World Comes to Hickory Hollow, or I'm sure I'm getting it wrong. But it's kind of a similar thing where it's a collapse of society and it's a dystopic universe, but almost the entire book takes place on a farm with people collaborating with each other and working together to survive this. And there's very little of that sort of familiar tribal, sort of like clashing between bands of survivors. It's most of the book is a group of people who are working really hard together to survive. And so, yeah, that idea of a kind of a cozy dystopia is so, when it's done well, it can be just great.
I think getting back to what you were saying, AT, I think, diversity of experience leaks into your writing, right? Diversity of social group leaks into your writing. I mean, I think you take a look at, who your friends are virtually and in real life, and understand that, if it's all white folks, or if it's all Latinos or majority, that you're, or all abled folks or whatever, you're getting a very truncated vision, experience of the world. And to not write a truncated experience of the world, you need to sort of broaden your own experiences. I want to recommend absolutely not cozy book of dystopia that came out a couple of years ago now, written by Lisa Bradley. It's called Exile. And it's, and it's got a lot of violence, and it's got a lot of, sort of like infighting and whatever, but it's very interesting because it takes place in a border zone and is really just blows all sorts of Latino stereotypes, and is just a real roller coaster ride.
It's funny you talk about personal experience, and I think you're absolutely right, which is that you can't write about what you can't conceive. And it reminds me, we had taken this trip, my wife and I, to Brazil, and we felt like we were pretty well versed in hardship and how rough life can get, having seen poverty in the States. But it takes an entirely different form in South America. And as we're riding through, we're taking a taxi cab from our very comfortable hotel to a historical part of Salvador de Bahia, and we're passing by favelas, and I had never seen, like on TV, of course you've seen them, but I had never seen real favelas in real life. And you suddenly realize that you're looking at a structure where there's an entire wall missing on the front of this dwelling, and in America nobody would be living in it, but there's a line of laundry and a light bulb, and you can see that people are occupying that space, and how different their lives are from anything I had conceived as as a kid growing up poor in America. I was, it was a mind sort of expanding experience to see what the rest of the world experiences as hardship, as opposed to what you may have experienced in a different circumstance.
It's interesting too that from those informal cities, from the favelas in Brazil or slums in Mumbai, have come a number of adaptations that are, to design and to, sort of different environmental issues that now, sort of global North folks are looking at as low cost, innovative, ingenious ways that people with, nothing have repurposed things. And so, we have to be cautious of not being extractive of that. But we also need to recognize that, those are, some of the hidden things of quote unquote dystopias are just the amazing amount of innovation and resourcefulness.
The way people adapt. I think, so I've been doing research for a story I'm going to write, and it's all about like cities in the future and what people will do. And I was reading about the urban farming happening in Argentina, because basically a lot of the government programs or shipments from outside farms disappeared, and people need to make money / food, so they started growing a lot of crops within cities, and it's been extremely profitable as well as eco-friendly. And I mean, that's something I could totally see cities around the world adapting, especially as farms face more droughts, traditional farms around the world. So
to go with what Sabrina said about not being extractive, the idea that those of us who are not yet in dystopia, who have that privilege but are teetering toward dystopia, have a lot to learn from those who are unfortunately living in semi-dystopias. I mean, to paraphrase William Gibson, dystopia is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. So, there is a lot to be learned there, but to take that and go back to what Eliza said about what we need in the fiction aspect of it, as opposed to the real world, what would need to occur is, both the setting of dystopic works of fiction, not in the privileged world, but in the less privileged world, and also to populate it with not, us, white cis het dude guys, and make sure that both in terms of the characters who were seen to survive, which Sabrina was saying, centering those people and also putting them in those settings. So too often it is, how does someone in a place of privilege survive when they say, oh my goodness, I turn on the light switch and the electricity doesn't happen. What do I do now? So much of the fiction comes from that aspect. So we need those two things to happen, both the setting and the character, to give a broader picture of what dystopia really means in the world.
So I'm gonna actually try to tackle some of the questions we're getting from our audience, because it's we have some good ones, but I'm gonna combine two. So let's talk a little bit about the emotions. Someone asked for talking about joy in dystopias like 1984 and Clockwork Orange, and someone also wanted us to discuss a little bit Octavia Butler's dystopias and the emotions in there. And what I think I'm going to add on to that. What does she add to those dystopian that the other two books don't? Because I think she has a more rounded view. Anyone want to start?
It's funny. I had seen that question about moments of joy in 1984 and A Clockwork Orange, and I had actually gone back to a moment in 1984 to find exactly that. And there's a moment where Winston is out, in this field, and it's a place that he's dreamed of, right? And he's just kind of having this moment where the sun and the breeze and the smell is such an amazing, joyful experience for him. Of course, it's shadowed with, don't go over there because they might see you. But in this one little place, in this moment, he's feeling this real touch of what could be if he were, free and to love the way he wanted to love and to live the way he wants to live and all of that. And it's a short moment, and it what it does, I think, is it really sells the deprivation later when he gets taken to the Ministry of Love, and it's all taken away. But A Clockwork Orange, I'm not sure I could think of a moment of joy in A Clockwork Orange. It's a pretty bleak book, and the only joy that's experienced in it is experienced by an absolutely reprehensible person. So it's that one's harder.
Yeah, it really is, because the only joy that is experienced through violence,
Mhm.
right? So it's it's one of those where it's it's so perverse that it's problematic in that sense.
And for some writers, that's actually the entire point. I mean, what does Orwell say? Imagine the future, it's a boot stamping in the human face forever. And if that's what you want to say, you're not going to populate it with the joy that others might want to see.
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that I think a lot of like adult dystopias are much more bleak and harder to find the like joy moments as versus like YA dystopia, which very often has like an undercurrent of hope, like spread throughout the story, and very often ends on this like sort of hopeful upswelling of emotion. And so those two I would be difficult. Like I'm impressed you found one instance. So
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference between like those two books and like Octavia Butler's Parable of Soul is like in 1984, the joy is just a moment to lift you up before everything cuts you down, versus Octavia Butler, which has a lot more range of human emotion. Like there's a lot more anger. There's a lot more, if I say determination, hope, moments of happiness, moments of trying to make the best decision they can against in dire circumstances.
And that book is set in like the 2020s, I think.
Yeah, like now.
Yeah. So here we are in Octavia Butler's future.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you, Holly, mentioned Meg Ellison's trilogy, the first of which, the Book of the Unnamed Midwife, won the Philip K. Dick Award. But I think there's joy mixed in there with the
Oh
dread
yeah,
as well.
that one has definitely got a lot of like hopeful moments and like romance and kind of relationships that are joyful, because I think we miss that a lot. Like I'm not saying every dystopia needs like a romance thread, but it is sort of nice to have those like relationship moments where it's sort of joyful and the characters connect. I mean, I think about that a lot because like my husband just came home last night from the hospital where he's treating COVID pediatric patients, and I'm like, we're just going to sit here and be together because that helps people get through. So yeah.
On the other hand, YA dystopias have way too much romance.
Yeah. Well, you're gonna have that, you know.
Well, I'll tie it into one of the audience question. Is it considered dystopia if it has a happy ending, if they successfully overthrow a government? I mean, is that truly dystopia, a success?
I
Oh,
think a lot,
sure.
yeah, I think it still counts. I think a lot of those new governments end up becoming also terrible in the sequel.
You know, the other part is, I mean, part of what I did with Ink is frame it through the Guatemalan genocide of indigenous folks. And, you know, the repercussions of that 30 years after the peace accord was reached and the government supposedly, you know, stopped trying actively to eliminate indigenous peoples and people who were dissenting with it are innumerable. I mean, there's still a hashtag "Si hubo genocidio." Yes, there was a genocide, and you know, this is the fact that the specific conditions or the specific government gets overthrown is in no way indicative that the dystopia is over. You could have a dystopia that started with the overthrow of some authoritarian government and spent its entire time, you know, grappling with the repercussions of that. And I hate to say this, but I really feel that for the US political situation, that's true. We're going to be grappling with the sides of the past 4 years that were very authoritarian and destructive. And we're going to be grappling with that for a long time.
Well, yeah, certainly, because it's shifted the Overton window, and what we believe to be normal conservative thought now is so much more radical than it used to be. You know, it's funny because I think about like a utopian society with a really dark underbelly as being essentially dystopian. I think of Those Who Walk Away from O'Malley's.
Mm-hmm.
Right, where the world is great and everything's perfect, but in order to achieve that, you have to torture, you know, a child, and you know, and sacrifice them, and you think, well, that's, you know, that's exactly what Sabrina seems to be talking about. It's like we move away from these things, and then bury them, right, and refuse to acknowledge them because that's, you know, not letting go of it means that you have to continue to experience the pain of it, but that is as much an injustice as perpetuating it, right? Is that we don't recognize and confront our past and ensure that we don't either make reparations or try to avoid doing it again in the future. You know, it's the hidden O'Malley's.
There's a really great answer story to that by N.K. Jemisin called The Ones Who Stay and Fight.
Oh, I have to read that.
You have to read that.
Yeah.
It's really good because it very much like answers that question of like, are we stuck in a binary decision where we either stay here and be miserable and live in the utopia that is a dystopia, or do we just walk away? And you know, there is a third answer.
Is that in her collection? Is that in How Long Till Black? I know what I'm doing this afternoon.
It's also on it's been reprinted in Lightspeed.
Oh, okay.
Or maybe it's originally printed. I'm not sure, but it's in Lightspeed. But I like that one a lot because it answered what always bugged me about the one to
Right.
walk away.
Yeah, thinking about whether you can have a happy ending in a dystopia made me think about some of my own dystopias that I started to realize, well, were these dystopias or not? If you have a story in which the entire human race is destroyed, but the robots get to live happily ever after, or the artificial intelligences leave the planet and go off and have fun together, even though we're not here anymore. Yeah, I guess it was a dystopia, but someone had a happy ending. So to some extent, it's a matter of perspective.
Well, on that note, I apologize we didn't get to a bunch of questions, but there's one here that says, "Our dystopia is always the end. Can we believe in Gandhi? The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice." And I figured that might be a good question to end on, since we have 5 minutes left.
I hope so. I hope that Gandhi is right and that it's not the end, because that's what we're living in. It feels like every day. But yeah,
It's just longer than we like to imagine it is. It's not even decades sometimes, it's sometimes centuries,
Right,
right?
it's generations. Yeah, I was going to say I don't see the arc of history bending in an appreciable way in my lifetime, but little by little. But it is hard to imagine sort of a complete reprieve, right, from all these elements of society that give it dystopic flavor, right? Maybe, hopefully, one day.
Yeah, I mean, the good point is there will be something after the dystopia, but the downside is not necessarily the people living through the dystopia.
Right.
That we're not all necessarily going to get there. The world might get through it, and grandchildren and great grandchildren, and a century or two hence might have the world without it. But for the people in it, I guess it all decides where do you end the story and say it's over. For those people, there is no happy ending. They just have to hope. I'm not going to get to the other side of the mountain. Not going to get to the mountaintop, but for someone else, they'll get it.
Yeah, no, it's that great saying, that people with forethought are the ones who plant trees they'll never get to see the shade of. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, on that note, thank you everyone for coming. We still have a few minutes. Is there any like wrap-up thoughts, or I don't know if people are around after this and want to try to tackle some of the questions I didn't get to on Discord. But how about we do this? Where do we find you online, dear panelists?
I'm at scottedelman.com and on Twitter at Scott Edelman. And I'll just mention in the last minute, one other dystopic book I really liked was The Core of the Sun by Johannes Nisalo. Is a good book to track down. I won't go into detail, just track it down.
I am at Holly Lynn Walrath on Twitter, and you can check out my small press, Interstellar Flight Press, and our new books that are coming up on our website, interstellarflightpress.com.
I'm at sabrinaverbulius.com. Sorry about that.
No.
And my Twitter is follow the lead, and lead is spelled LEDE as it is in journalism. And I'm delighted to engage with folks.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Bracken McLeod. BrackenMcLeod.com takes you to a site for my books. There are a couple of free stories there. Like I said, I tend not to write in dystopian fiction. So if that's what you're looking for, you're not going to find it at my site. But I'd love to interact with people out in other places.
Great, and you can find me at ATGreenblatt on Twitter and atgreenblatt.com. That's my blog. And I did write a few dystopic stories. They're all free online. One's called Heavy Lifting. It could be found in Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction. And more recently, what was it called? One Time a Reluctant Traveler, which can be found in Clarksworld. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming to this early morning panel, and it was a delight, and I wish you a happy, healthy rest of the summer. Stay safe, stay optimistic, call Sanders, plant trees, do all that.
Build community.
Build communities. Yep.
Exactly, and learn how to sew.
Yeah. or at least be able to learn how to mediate between people. I feel like that's going to be a
Right.
one skill in the future.
There we go. Wonderful